Welcome to the Lens of History. You are with Luke Herbert, speaking with special guests and placing the microscope on current and historical events.
Welcome to this latest installment of the Lens of History. This program of Keith Nell, the author of Viscount Down, is the first in a series of programs that first appeared on a now defunct podcast, and this program is a special extended edition that does go beyond the show's usual half-hour format, and I have chosen to preserve the show in its original extended format to preserve the subject matter and what Keith has said in the best possible manner. Keith in his own right is a remarkable man, and he has a remarkable true account of very little known events. So please take the time to enjoy this program and think about the things you hear from our guest, and take the time to read Keith's book. I'm Luke Herbert, host and founder of the Lens of History. We now join Luke Herbert and Keith Nell in the studio.
Well, for Keith Nell, about his book Viscount Down. The book is available from viscountdown.com in hardcover and paperback format, and the Kindle version is available on Amazon. The Rhodesian problem was a lot more complex than the critics of Ian Smith's government would make out at the time and would make out today. While I have no time for racial segregation, it must be also remembered that fundamentally evolution of the majority of the population in Rhodesia was the correct way of thinking, simply because all societies evolve naturally at a slow but steady rate. We can see this with the likes of women's rights that start with women getting the right to vote, but demands for equal pay for women didn't really start till the 1970s. Another example is gay rights. The gay rights movement started roughly around the 70s, but the calls for gay marriage will not be successful until around 2012 and perhaps 2013, depending on where you live. The sheer brutality of which the survivors of the first Viscount aircraft were shown will leave the reader feeling a sick feeling in their stomach and perhaps even uneasy at night, but that's what it should do. And also remember that it took the Americans 10 years to hunt down Osama bin Laden, and the missile gang that brought down the Viscount aircraft was found in a matter of months. So does this mean that the Western world that has contributed forces to the war in Afghanistan and elsewhere, do we have to rethink our strategy, the way we use special forces? There's a lot to think about, but at the end of the day, majority rule brought ruin to what is present-day Zimbabwe. And today, if you were to take someone free of duress, who was old enough to remember Ian Smith's government in Zimbabwe, they would take the old regime over Mugabe any day. I am speaking with Keith Nell. He is the author of Viscount Down, the complete story of the Rhodesian Viscount disasters, as told by a SAS operator. So, how are you doing today, Keith?
I'm very well, thank you. And you?
Oh, I'm doing excellent because I get to chat with you about your book that I thoroughly enjoyed. And all right, then we'll get right down to things. And just to start off with, can you just explain why the book is split up into two parts? The narrative of the little-known historical events and the supporting evidence, the documentation, is in the second half of the book.
Yeah, certainly. The book is split into two parts, mostly for authentication purposes, because it is a radical story, not only about the crashes of the two Vickers Viscount aircraft in which 107 people were killed, but also the follow-up operations and the hunt for the perpetrators that brought the these aircraft down with SAM-7 missiles. It's a radical story, and therefore it requires authentication. That's what that's why there's two parts to the book. I've got a lot of documents in the second part of the book, which supports everything that I've written about, and they also put pay to any speculation about controversial issues that are not fully addressed in my book, perhaps, but for example, whether or not the air hostesses who survived the crash landing were raped or not, that has been a debated issue for a long time. That is addressed in my book, but I've got doctor's certificates there which tell the true story. And then also it has been construed by some, the underminers and the disbelievers and the likes of them, that these aircraft crashed because of metal fatigue and not by missiles. But I was lucky to find the original forensic ballistic analysis, which proves beyond doubt that they were SAM-7 missiles that brought them down. There was also some other documents that are rare that contribute to the reader's general interest. So all round it is a complete manual, as it were, or book on the entire ambit of these disasters.
And just before we go any further, I think there's a critical question I do need to ask. And can you just explain to the listener the difference between what was practiced as apartheid in South Africa and what was termed minority rule in Rhodesia?
Certainly. The question you've asked is a difficult one to answer in a few words, because it's a complex situation. But basically, and I need to go back just a little bit for the reader's understanding, that when the white settlers arrived in Rhodesia, which is now known as Zimbabwe, there were only probably between 375, 400,000 black people there altogether, and it had been like that for centuries because of famines, wars, pestilences, illnesses and things like that. But after the white people arrived, and they brought with them medical technology, industrial technology and the likes of that, the situation grew very fast. In 1921, which was probably the first official consensus, it was established that there were 33,600 whites and approximately 900,000 others from Bantu tribes and Matabele tribes that had come up from South Africa, and coloured. So the population expansion was huge. Now, when the settlers first arrived, what had actually happened was that the blacks were mostly peasant farmers, and they hadn't even seen a wheel before. There was no hardware in the form of iron or metal plows or anything like that. They relied upon wooden tools to do their farming with, and as a result of that, most of them were already established in farming areas that had lighter soils than what the white population coming in could deal with. The whites preferred the heavier soils because they had the technology to go with it, the metal plows and the likes of that. So that is how the split of land allocation took place. And by the time let's say at the end of the Second World War came along, those racial divides were already in place. And roughly Rhodesia had about 50% of the land was owned by black Africans, and the other by whites. Now that was different in South Africa. South Africa under apartheid, and also I'd like to explain that apartheid means separate development, separate culture, separate living, and it was a very cruel system, and it was intended for that to be a permanent structure in the course of time. And whereas in Rhodesia, the political aim was evolutionary, meaning that in time, black Africans would achieve sufficient standards to take over the full role. Now, racial segregation in Rhodesia was then similar to what it was in South Africa circa 1948. The Land Appropriation Act and its successor, the Land Tenure Act, divided Rhodesia, as I say, roughly into two halves, and the towns that were established, and bear in mind there were no towns whatsoever in 1890. In the short space of 70 years, cities were established, roads were built, railway lines were built, mines were established, communications were set up, hospitals were set up, education facilities were set up. So, and in the same period of time, the country was subjected to the Boer War, the First World War, the Chimurenga War, in which the Matabeles and to take over the country again, but were defeated, and then the Second World War. So it was a country of huge adjustment, conflict, development and growth pains. So that accounts for the fact that the towns were mostly in European areas for structural reasons, and the urban blacks were confined to designated townships without free ownership at first. The Asian and coloured communities that were also designated areas but with freehold, and education was segregated by the four communities. In late 1950s and early 1960s, under the influence of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, multiracialism became adopted by Sir Edgar Whitehead. The pass laws which governed the movements of blacks were replaced by a registered certificate. The ban on sale of liquor to Africans was lifted. Multiracial hotels were allowed. Private schools were allowed to take all races, and the university was multiracial as well. Segregated buses, swimming pools, etc. were done away with. The land remained segregated, as did education and health. And the Rhodesian Front, which was the popular political party of the whites at that stage, attempted to undo some of the multiracial moves but were unsuccessful. And although education was segregated at first, it was of a very high standard with Africans. And those entering university were as equally prepared as were white students. Now, that is one of the first things that I noticed when I got to Rhodesia from South Africa in 1968. One of the strongest motivators for me to immigrate from South Africa was the cruel apartheid system that was just unacceptable altogether. And what I noticed when I got to Rhodesia, that most of the blacks, there wasn't the same animosity towards whites that there was in South Africa. And they were very pleasant fellows. They were educated, they could converse, whereas, bear in mind, in 1890, when the whites first arrived, they were completely illiterate. They couldn't write or read. So the transformation was vast, was huge. And unfortunately, it wasn't destined to last like that. And that mostly came about by the thrust of the Eastern Bloc to establish a foothold in Africa for their quest for world domination. And that's when revolution and communist insurgency started to take over, and coupled with the decolonization period from Britain and the States, that just threw the whole thing upside down. And that's why we've got Zimbabwe as a dictatorship, which was the inevitable consequence of, let's say, self-governance before people were qualified to take over the country. That is the history in a nutshell of Rhodesia and the apartheid versus evolutionary development and takeover by blacks. I hope that illustrates it well enough.
Oh, it does very nicely, thank you. But in the second half of your book, you document the political motivations behind the missile campaign that brought down the Viscount aircraft, and it stems from Joshua Nkomo's efforts to subvert the majority Shona population. So can you just outline what his motivations were for this? Because it's quite easy for the international listener not familiar with Rhodesia to not really understand the significance of this.
The significance was that it gets around to a central issue of majority rule. And in around about in 1965, when Britain demanded that Rhodesia had immediate majority rule, that started the UDI, Unilateral Declaration of Independence, and a series of political developments that happened very rapidly after that. And by 1977, it became clear that an internal settlement was needed because the situation was unsustainable. It was going to be unsustainable for a long period of time. So what happened was it was consistent with Margaret Thatcher's pre-election manifesto, in which she said that she would accept or let's say if the Conservative government came into power, that Conservative government would accept an internal settlement within Rhodesia by all parties. And that is what happened. In March 1978, the Prime Minister of Rhodesia, Ian Smith, invited all black nationalists, and those externally in exile as well as internally, to take part in a settlement. And it was that settlement guaranteed black majority rule. And amnesty was issued to guerrillas who would lay down their arms, because that was what they had been fighting for. Okay, now in Nkomo, his position was that he wasn't going to win post-war elections, not on any account. But he was backed up by the Russians, and he operated from Zambia, whereas Mugabe was backed up by the Chinese, and he operated from Mozambique. Problem was that Nkomo had about 20% of the country's population were Matabeles, that was his tribal race, and Mugabe's consisted of 80% of the country's population, they were Shona. Now, there was no way whatsoever that any of those two tribes was going to tolerate governance by one over the other. They, for centuries, they'd had tribal hatred between them, and nothing was going to change about that, and it still hasn't even today. Now, as a result of that, the only way that Nkomo could win the post-war elections is through an outright military victory. And that is why he did not participate in the settlement agreement. He had to win by an outright military victory. And the strategy was, as was posed by the Russians, was that they would speed up the war and take on the Rhodesian security forces first and get rid of them, and then defeat Mugabe, and then Rhodesia would become his. So that's actually the beginning of the missile campaign, because to defeat the Rhodesian government, he launched this campaign to bring down passenger aircraft. And the reason for that is they wanted to demoralize the civilian population and put pressure on the Rhodesian government to succumb to political demands. And that in turn would compel them to end the war. That would have the Rhodesians out of the way, and then he would be free to take on the Mugabe and Ishonas. And to that end, Nkomo in the early, we'll say early to mid phases of 1979 already had 20,000 fighters established in Zambia. They were well trained as well, better than Mugabe's mob. So, and they were working towards having two fully mechanized divisions in which they could enter the country and push downwards towards Salisbury, and which is now Harare, and to take over the country that way. So the fight was on. Never mind any settlements or anything else. That is what was going to happen, and that is why Mugabe didn't accept the internal settlement either, because he knew the fight was on, and unless he fought that fight, he was going to lose out. So that strategy of bringing down civilian aircraft was to create such a catastrophic shock to the nation that it would achieve all those ends. And that is how the missile campaign got born. And the strategy And it was very successful, by the way, as we all know now in retrospect. And that strategy was recognized by other terrorist organizations in latter years for being very successful, and became the blueprint of bringing down civilian aircraft for political purposes, and even culminating with Lockerbie and the Twin Towers disasters. So the two Viscount crashes were actually the first of the 9/11 styled attacks to destroy civilian passenger carrying aircraft in flight for the same purposes. And there have been subsequent attempts. Not long ago, there was an Al-Qaeda plan to bring down 7 aircraft in flight between Europe and America. And they were all going to come down simultaneously on the same day when they were too far distant between either continents to turn back. But luckily, MI6 picked this up, and they closed in on the group and detained the whole lot of them before they could put their plan into attack. And even with the Libyan campaign, one of the first things that Gaddafi said was, if you strike against my country, I will bring down holiday planes with missiles. So that is a favorite terrorist threat that hasn't gone away even today. Sorry, I did diversify a little bit, but I think it's important that people actually realize the ramifications of what was really going on, and how the missile campaign featured, and why it became such a crucial issue.
All right, Dan, and we're just going to move on to the MO employed by the terrorists in the villages in Rhodesia, and it's centered around a link man who acted as the eyes and ears for the terrorists and would inform them when Rhodesian security forces or the Rhodesian army would arrive, and the link man sort of relied on what Westerners and Europeans would think of as a herd boy, except the herd boys were not traditional farmers as I would think of them. They spent their early childhood life basically in long grass, looking out for lions, and if they didn't do the job properly, the cattle got eaten, and they got eaten as well. So can you tell us about that?
Yes, I'll just start with the linkman. The linkman was a terrorist in civilian clothes who would be stationed at some population centre within the community, the farming peasant farming community, a rural farming community, I should say. And his job, he would know where the terrorist gangs were located, and normally he would be answerable to one particular gang a resident gang that would operate in a certain area, and his job was to collect information from the locals that was of a strategic value. Now, the herd boy, which the blacks call Majibas, followed tribal custom. So when a youth was growing up, and it started round about from the age of about 5, he would work with his brothers in the field, and the fields were mostly bush and long grass and the likes, and they would attend to their animals grazing and out there, and to make sure that they were protected against predators wherever possible, and we had lions and leopards and hyenas and the likes. And also, I would imagine, against rogues who would steal their lives given half the chance. So because they were occupied in the rural bush, they would be the first to see the arrival of security forces, and therefore they became the eyes and ears of the terrorist forces, and they were compelled to report the presence of security forces to the local linkman, who in turn would know where to locate the terrorist gang and go and inform them of the strength of the security forces that had arrived and the direction that they were going, and so on. And that is why the terrorists were very difficult to find. But we weren't told that initially. And when I'm saying we, it was when I was in police anti-terrorist unit for a few years. Our job was to roam the countryside looking for terrorist sections to take on, and we found them very difficult to locate. That was because of this phenomenon that I've been talking about. Now, the Majiba became a very dangerous and feared, and even within their own community. And that was because if one of them carried a grudge against a fellow tribesfolk or a parent, all it took was for them to invent a malicious story and pass it on to the link man for retribution to take place. And that retribution was severe. They cut off lips and ears and clubbed people to death in front of their family. The family had to were forced to eat the lips and ears of the victims, and they were terrorized beyond the imagination of most people. So during the course of our operations, when I say I'm talking about now in latter years, I'd already joined the SAS, and I was assigned to special forces for a particular operation, and that was to hunt down the group that brought down the aircraft with missiles. That is how the link man became identified, is from the local population that told us about this, and we twigged onto that very quickly, and we decided that the best way to disrupt Nkomo's insurgent forces and to break the grip that they had on the population in that area was to destroy their communication system and coordination of their terrorist units. And so we focused on taking out the link man, which actually short-circuited the whole process and was very successful.
All right, and I want to move forward now to the shoot down of the first Viscount aircraft, flight RH825, and the plane comes down, and the pilots did a magnificent job to get the aircraft down, but the aircraft did sadly end up in a ditch that the pilots couldn't have seen from the air. But the only people that ended up surviving had got out of the aircraft and had left another group of survivors behind, and these people went in search of water and assistance, and while they were gone, the survivors were brutally massacred. And one particularly gruesome facet in your book, and I believe it also may be mentioned in the DVD that acts as a companion, is a baby whose mother handed him off to someone, knowing that she was at the end of her life, and this baby's bayoneted death. But moving along, in your book you do have testimony from a 20-year veteran of the Rhodesian SAS who, when he arrived on the scene the next day, he felt nauseous. So can you just sort of explain to the listener what it takes for a 20-year veteran of the Rhodesian SAS to feel that way?
Yeah, it's not difficult. The thing to remember here is that some of those people there were 10 women and children mostly, and one male adult who were bayoneted and shot to death by a second group of terrorists that arrived. They had been attending a beer drink nearby where the plane crashed, so that's how come they popped up on the scene so quickly. And so the air hostesses were certainly known to some of our members on a personal basis. We've got to understand that the population of Salisbury or Harare was approximately 200,000 people. So everybody more or less knew somebody or the other that was involved in these crashes. And it was the shock of seeing the bodies in that terrible condition that brought nausea upon some. Had they not known them personally, the effect would be different. And I have an analogy to that, and that is when my mother had a very serious car crash in her older days, and I went to the hospital to go and see her there, and her condition was so bad that I actually passed out. So the shock effect comes fast. And at that stage, just about anybody who's been in the SAS for a year was already a veteran. Had plenty contacts, seen lots of bodies, some blown to bits with grenades and holes in their heads and all of that. And by that stage, that sort of thing didn't affect us. But the difference was that we didn't know any of those people personally. Wait till you know somebody personally and see the condition that they're in when they've been hammered like that, shot, bayoneted, and all the rest. It's a gruesome, and it's that shock effect that produced that nausea. So some of them probably didn't feel nauseous, but the effect took place in a different way, like wanting to pass out and that. And then the doctors actually said that they had to treat a number of these people for trauma.
All right, and I just want to come back to your childhood, which you describe. You describe it a little bit in your book, and your mother was very busy with her teaching career because your father was missing in action in the war, and between your mother teaching daytime and the evening, she didn't have a lot of time for you, and she seems to have been very emotionally distant as well. So you seem to have learnt as a child not to feel sorry for yourself, and you inadvertently gain attributes that would help you later on as a member of the Rhodesian SAS. So can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes. Well, my father got called up, or he volunteered to go to war in the Second World War. I was born in 1940, and at that stage there was already conflict between my mother and father, and they were actually going through a divorce when I got born. So the truth is that I was an unwanted child, and there was an emotional distance between us, and that never went away. But it had upsides and downsides. I mean, it could have been a lot worse. I was the only sibling, and I wasn't physically abused, but definitely I was made to feel guilty most of the time for things that I couldn't account for, and that taught me about forming conclusions balanced with reality, or based on reality. And I learned about that at an early life, and I was able to distinguish the severity of other situations and what to do about them through self-reliance at an early age, and that helped me tremendously. I don't think my mother could have done anything better for me than to have brought that on, but it took many years for me to realize that. You know, in the SAS, there are times where you are alone for long periods of time, even if you've got other people around you. Maybe you're in a small section of, say, 4 people or 2, whatever, and our operations were done silently. You didn't talk. It was hand signals and clicks of the tongue and things like that you communicated with, and the mind needed to be occupied, and occupied with positive things, always working out the best chances of survival and the best chances of achieving your mission, whatever it might be. Failure is totally out of the question, and aborting missions also totally out of the question. So that self-reliance and to have a calculating mind as to exactly in changing circumstances what to do, you had to be able to think outside the square, the normal square of reasoning and thinking, and to be adaptable, and I put it down to that early process of learning that was brought about through our circumstances at home.
Yeah, it is funny how past events can inadvertently prepare someone for the future. I found with all the Christchurch earthquakes that there are some bad experiences in the past, and not so recent past, with family members who, should we say, let me down would be the simple way of putting it. It actually ended up preparing me to cope for the earthquakes in a rather strange, twisted way. So I can't identify with your experiences specifically in the SAS, but I can to some degree identify with what you're talking about. But there's a couple of very emotional components to the book for me, and the first one is the shoot down of the first Viscount aircraft and the massacre of the survivors, and that one's fairly obvious, and I think it will affect the reader. But on a more personal basis, there's a couple of things that affected me emotionally, and I want to come back to a brief sort of segment you have in your book, and you talk about having a nightmare after coming back from an operation with the SAS, and it brought back memories of my father telling me when I was a child how he'd had nightmares to do with his service in Vietnam. So, did these nightmares continue?
The nightmare I had, that was described in my book, only occurred once as far as I can remember. I did have some other dreams about being on operations, but they were mild by comparison, and I've had them very spasmodically and rarely over the last 2-3 decades. But they're nothing. They're not symbols of post-traumatic stress disorder or anything else like that. I think they just came natural. Bear in mind that I wanted to be where I was in the first place. So what had actually happened was, after the Viscounts were brought down, a series of external attacks took place, and whether this particular attack in Mozambique was as a result of retribution or not, I don't know, but it was a particularly hectic operation. We were dropped in by chopper over in a triangular formation, and at each extremity of the triangle there were about 40 people, 40 of us SAS guys positioned to do different things. And my group, our task was to take on the headquarters section of this extended terrorist camp. Now, we didn't know that, but there were 10,000 Gurks there, and the odds were very, let's say, unbalanced. And the Russians had got them to dig a series of crisscross trenches, and they were very well entrenched, very heavily armed. They had tanks, mortar bombs, and everything else. So it was a full-scale war that we got into when we arrived there. And in the first part of the first day of the operation, we were waiting for our bombers to arrive to come and soften up the area ahead of us, and we took cover in a plantation of very large trees. And when I say large trees, if you extended both arms around the trunk of the tree, you'd only get halfway around it. So that's how big the trees were. And during when the hunter hawkers arrived with the bombs, these were golf bombs that weighed 1,000 pounds each. They dropped 2 of them on us inadvertently, and they landed about 40 paces from behind where we were sitting. And the shock effect is what kills people as well as the shrapnel, but that was absorbed by the branches and the trees, the trunks of the trees. I can remember the shrapnel coming past in the avenues between the trees, kicking up dust as it sort of advanced past us. And we were extremely lucky. This is one of the occasions where I believe destiny played a hand, and only one of our guys got killed, and another one had shrapnel in his leg. But apart from that, there was nothing else really that decimated us at all, except that it affected my vision for a little bit, as well as my hearing. Even today, my hearing's not as good as what it should because of that. So at night, the tank started up, and we're putting down shells in random places to see if they could flush us out. So during the day, we skirmished amongst these trenches. There were so many Gurks that as we cleared trenches ahead of us, came in from behind and took cover in the same trenches we just cleared. So it was a process of going backwards and forwards the whole time, and the bullets were flying in every direction. You could hear every time an aircraft came in to fire its cannons or to drop bombs, you could hear the fire from ground forces, enemy ground forces at the aircraft rising into a crescendo. So it was a hectic period. And then that night, the first night, we found a piece of bush that gave us a bit of protection, and we went in single file. We formed a circle. We all faced outwards, and we could hear the Gurks calling each other very close to our proximity. And between that and the tanks shooting at us and so on, it was a pretty stressful situation, and it endured the whole night. Now, when I got back to Salisbury 2 days later, the operation lasted 3 or 4 days. When I got back to Salisbury and we cleared camp, I went back to my apartment the first night, and I fell asleep. And in my dream, I dreamt that I was in that circle, and I could hear these Gurks closing in on us. And I was shouting to my mates to wake up because they're coming, and we had to do something about it. Nobody would wake up, and that caused me to thrash around in my bed a bit. And I woke up, and at first, the situation had been so real that it took me a good half minute or so lying absolutely dead still before I could really be sure that I wasn't in Mozambique in that circle, and that I was actually in my apartment. Now, that was the only time that I'd had such a horrendous nightmare. So I can understand when people say that they have post-traumatic stress disorder and stuff like that. I can understand how that comes about. Luckily for me, it didn't affect me much. Only that once, but I never forgot that nightmare. You don't need those in your life.
Yeah, I would agree that no one would want to have nightmares in their life. And just to sort of explain a bit to the listener, the other sort of emotional component of that segment of the book was for me is when you described a friendly fire from the Rhodesian Air Force, from the Gulf bombs they dropped and the shrapnel it generated, because my father was seriously injured by shrapnel from a landmine in Vietnam. So the fact he had his own narrow escape, really, he's got a bit of shrapnel still left in him beside his heart, that obviously doctors concluded it was safer just to leave it there than to operate. So I can, on at least some level, identify with the sort of narrow escape you had, even if it is through a relative of mine. So that was very emotional for me. We'll be back with Keith Nell after this break.
This program is supported by 3 Feet Radio.
Anyway, I would like to move on now to the reaction to the shoot down of the first Viscount aircraft. There was naturally a lot of anger and outrage within Rhodesia, but the international community, there was a silence that descended upon world leaders, and that it's very difficult to fathom today, just because of the sheer brutality of the act and what happened. So can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, the reaction in Rhodesia, and I'm talking about from both the white and black population in general, was total shock, horror and anger. In fact, the anger more so from the white community was absolutely white hot. There was no condemnation from the international community whatsoever, not from any of the Western leaders, because up to then they had been supporting the terrorist factions of Mugabe and Nkomo, and they were, after the Hanyani event, particularly with the massacre, they were cowering in silence to protect their political careers. And that was particularly offensive to us, because you've got to remember that Rhodesia fought alongside our Western allies in World War I and II against tyranny, and this is exactly what we were facing ourselves. So then the BBC conducted a televised interview with Nkomo, in which he bragged and chortled during the interview that his forces had been responsible, and that of course ignited the anger even further in Rhodesia, and our Prime Minister Ian Smith was forced to cancel his secret talks he was having with Nkomo to form an alliance against Mugabe, and to attack his Nkomo's camps in Zambia instead. He had to do something, and the population wasn't going to tolerate anything else other than retribution for the attack. Now, what the terrorists were doing in Zambia was a common solution, or let's say improvisation against being attacked, and that was to bring in some of the civilian population and to have their thousands of terrorists protected by the civilian population, on the premise that it would be wrong for reprisals to take place because of the damage and injury to the civilian population, which would not be acceptable. I, for one, had no sympathy with that. That would give terrorist camps, and I'm talking about large camps now, license to exist without any control from the countries that were being attacked. So the whole thing got a bit nasty after that, and to this day, black dissidents from and political groups in Zimbabwe are still complaining about the civilians that got hurt there. So these were all ongoing effects of the lack of condemnation. It turned from condemnation against the Hanyani attacks to condemnation of security forces for having reprisals against them. In fact, actually changed the course of history in Southern Africa, with Ian Smith backing out or away from ongoing talks with Nkomo, and we all know what the result of that was. Eventually, Mugabe came into power, and we've seen the destruction of Zimbabwe, and millions of Zimbabwean blacks now, as well as the few hundred 100,000 Watts that were left have all been displaced in other countries across the world, and we've seen the plunder that's taken place in Zimbabwe and the utter misery that it's caused. And well, I don't think there's anything to add about that.
Just before we move on in the interview, and it's on the accompanying DVD to the book as well, but now I'm not a religious man, but I must say that the service given by the Reverend DaCosta, he gave a speech, if you like, called The Deafening Silence, and even for someone like me, he's just so on the money. He hits it for 6, or for our American friends, he hits it out of the ballpark, and he's just, even as just someone who's read your book and seen the DVD, it's touching without even having been in the church and been in Rhodesia. And also, I think it's worth touching on Bishop Tutu speaking out against the shoot down of the aircraft, and it does that man credit, I believe, to his character when there was so much silence otherwise. But can you just touch upon the deafening silence?
Yes, in his memorial speech, or service, sorry, the Reverend DaCosta did lambaste Western leaders, the church groups like the World Council of Churches. There was no condemnation from the Archbishop of Canterbury or the Pope, or even the doctors like Dr. Owen, whose oath was, or creed was, to protect human life. And of course, Jimmy Carter, the peanut farmer in America, who is from the Baptist Bible Belt. They had nothing to say about this. And in his sermon, Costa said that the events, particularly the murder of the most savage in nature, a treacherous extent, stank in the nostrils of heaven. Now, I, like you, am not the greatest in religion. I do believe in spiritual world, but throughout my book, when you look in retrospect, the absolutely astounding circumstances that arose, which seemed coincidental at the time, could not possibly have been coincidental. Not so many of them. Things unfolded, particularly at the right time, in the right circumstances, that permitted other sequential developments to take place that were also necessary in the whole jigsaw puzzle, putting it together. And right up until today, it has continued with the creation or the establishment of that magnificent memorial in Pretoria at the Voortrekker Monument, the memorial to the Viscount victims. It is the most beautiful memorial you could ever imagine, and that is also helped along the way by the great hand of destiny. I can assure you I have a great respect for, let's say, the forces of destiny, which actually was the original title of my book. The only reason why I changed it to Viscount Down was because people would not identify so easily the Viscount disasters with a title like the forces of destiny. But that is exactly what happened, and DaCosta wasn't wrong.
No. And yeah, as I said before, what DaCosta said is just so on the money, and I just like to reinforce to the listener what you are saying. There is extraordinary coincidences in the book that put the right people in the right place at the right time to help you on your way. And I hope you don't mind me expressing that way, because you didn't need help in the sense that you were very competent in what you're doing. But just to use one example, at one time when you're working with the auxiliary forces, you find that you find and encounter some Rhodesian light infantry who have helicopters that you can use. So that's just one instance of it. But moving along, I think we need to introduce the listener to Special Branch. You stumbled across Special Branch via a friend you ran into who wanted you to go to an interview. But before we get to that, Special Branch has its own way of operating, and they basically relied on blackmail, use of inducement via gifts, to accomplish a task or to get somebody to cooperate. So can you just sort of tell us a little bit how those methods made you feel?
Well, when I first went for the interview, of course, with Special Branch, I was not actually interested in joining them. I went along just to be courteous, and I had no idea what or how powerful they were or are, and but I was soon to find out, because after it came about that I was tasked to go and sort out a mutiny of 100 former terrorists who accepted amnesty, and they were being retrained in a secret camp. That is when a special branch actually got me to go there in the first place, and that's how I became exposed to this. But I learned a great deal from them about undercover operations and informer networking that was crucial to the success of our mission. And in fact, it was crucial to me in establishing my security company later on when I returned to South Africa in the 80s. And that was why we were so successful, is purely from what I learned from Special Branch. Not so much that we used their techniques as far as obtaining favors from people who were at some future date going to be able to provide some kind of service or supplies or whatever, but from the point of view of interviewing hostile witnesses in order to get information from them without doing any skull bashing. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about. But anyway, that's a bit of a diversion from what you want to hear about. And I found out from quickly that Special Branch has a license to cheat, and they manipulate anything beyond the imagination of the ordinary man. Now, to summarize the role of Special Branch, they were really the strategic engineers to keep the course of the military strategy on counter-revolution, to keep that in motion. And when things didn't go right, it was up to Special Branch to manipulate the situation until it did go back according to plan. And a prime example of this is when I joined, when I was sent to sort out this mutiny. I was a trooper, and the Special Branch superintendent said to me that being a trooper wasn't going to cut it in the operational field. So he gave me a requisition. He said, go down to the quartermaster and go and get yourself a decent uniform. So I looked at the requisition, and it was for a captain's outfit. So in a single morning, I was promoted from trooper to captain, and although it was a bogus promotion, it wasn't an official one, but nevertheless I had to strut around with these captain's pips and amongst qualified officers and senior staff, and I can assure you that it's more difficult to be a bogus captain than one for real, because I had absolutely no idea of the protocol or anything that went with it. That was just one example. Another example was that they in this particular occasion, which is written about in my book, is that we needed to procure a fairly large amount of AK-47s at short notice, and the only way to do that was to get somebody else from Special Branch who had access to weapons to comply with our need. And this particular fellow, I found out, had been given a Citroen DS20 for his personal use some good few months before. And when it came to the time that we needed our AKs, the chief said to this particular character, how's the car going? Had it serviced lately? Everything going all right? And then the question came back, yes, can I help you? Because he knew what was coming. If the AKs weren't going to be there the next day, neither would the car be there. So we got the AKs, and they were like hen's teeth at that stage due to international sanctions. There wasn't not enough ammunition to train our people with, and so on. So things were tough, and this is how Special Branch operated. They even tried to bribe me with a car later on so that I wouldn't go back to the SAS, but I could see that one coming, and I told them to get rid of it, which didn't win any popularity with Special Branch, but nevertheless I didn't care about that. I just wanted to get back to the SAS.
And I'll say one thing: if I ever encounter Special Branch, I'm running for the hills as fast as I possibly can.
Yeah, and so you should.
No good's going to come of that. But returning to a serious, being more serious again, just for the program. Also, you talk about your initial interview with Special Branch in the book as well, and you walked away with the impression that the initial interview simply hadn't gone that well, and this is before you are able to obtain your bogus increase in rank. So I think it is worth just touching upon that, because
you kind of left the interview and you felt maybe patronised or you'd been condescended to towards, didn't you?
I actually felt quite insulted because the interview was supposed to be conducted along the lines as to whether I wanted to train a hit squad or not. And the hit squad, by the way, was these 100 terrorists or former terrorists that were stuck in this secret camp. And things weren't going too well in the camp. But it didn't register to me that if they were being trained by members of security forces, then why would they want me to go there? Perhaps I had a hangover or something, but it just didn't occur to me what the realities could have been. And of course, one wouldn't have imagined that there was trouble brewing in the camp. So when I got there, the special branch chief actually spoke down to me, and I didn't feel that was necessary. He made me feel like I was an entry-level trooper, which I wasn't. I was a trooper at that stage, but a fairly senior one. And the interview was over in 5 minutes flat, and he didn't even mention the hit squad. And at the end of the interview, he didn't say, well, thank you for coming along and shake my hand or anything. He sort of nodded towards the door. And from that, I had to conclude that it was the end of it. So I was actually pretty angry when I left there. And, you know, he said to me, why do I want to leave the SAS? And I said, I don't want to leave the SAS. I'm here out of courtesy to listen to what you have to say. And I managed to hold my tongue from saying, and up to that point, I'm not at all impressed. But anyway, I left there. And then about 2 or 3 days later, when I was totally convinced I'd never hear from them again, the phone rang, and it was this sort of associate of mine said, you know, we would like to come and visit you. Are you in? They brought some documents along the way, and they left them with me, and they said, we want you to read these documents. Now, those documents were actually very vital to the entire mission, because I learned a lot on the strategy of revolutionary warfare and counter-revolutionary warfare from them, and that is that the major object of the struggle between the opposing forces is to obtain the active participation of the majority, and this is what's so important, of the uncommitted populace. Now, they explained how to do that, and of course I was all ears and eyes about that, because that was essentially the whole criteria about what the war was all about. So I learned a few things, and I must say I was very impressed with that. And then I don't think it was more than a day later when there was a loud banging on my door, and here was the chief back again, and he said, you've got to come now because we've had this mutiny, and the instructors have been chased out of the camp under the threat of death, and there's got these 100 guys there, and they're armed to the teeth, and they're angry, and just now they're going to go back to war, and we can't take them out. We've got Fire Force on standby, but we can't take them out because they're Muzarewa's supporters. He was heading up the coalition government at that stage, and he couldn't be seen to have 100 of his followers being gunned down, especially on account of the fact that they were there on amnesty. So there was virtually no option but to go along. And I was actually on R&R from the SAS at that stage when this chief turned up and said, you've got to go along. And from there, it was the beginning of my story about getting involved with these former terrorists and how to quell the mutiny in a peaceful manner. And I can assure you it wasn't a 5-minute process of kiss and make up. No, not at all. These guys had been programmed to kill us, and we'd been programmed to kill them not more than 2 weeks before. So one had to understand the psyche that was involved with that. But that's another topic, if you like.
And you mentioned the psyche, and that sort of brings me to the question that probably aroused quite a bit of my interest when I was reading the book, is the mutiny came against members of the Selous Scouts who were their former instructors, and they had inadvertently used live ammunition in a training exercise and injured some of the members of the auxiliary force. So can you just touch upon the psyche and why, expand upon it a bit more, because it's key to why did the first lot of instructors failed so badly?
Well, when these terrorists, former terrorists who were then called auxiliaries, when the auxiliaries arrived, they clearly demonstrated that they thought that they were hotshots, and you could see that from the chains that were hanging from their necks and bandanas over their heads, and then they would have their shirts wide open and undone bootlaces and swagger around like that. And if there's anything that illustrates a gung-ho attitude, and that they were totally convinced that they were the number one revolutionary fighters of the world, that did it in sort of 5 to 10 seconds flat. So their psyche came from what they had been taught in their terrorist training camps in Mozambique, and that had to be changed. But the trouble was that they didn't believe it needed to be changed. And by being autocratic about it as a camp commander was only going to end up in getting a bullet in the back, because they would perceive me to be the problem and not them. And the problem can easily be eliminated with one round. So, which is actually what happened in a couple of other camps. So the way that I went about it was, first of all, I spent time listening to them, talking to them, finding out about what their concerns were, where they came from. And that is when I discovered that they actually came from the same area where the Viscount had been brought down, which raised my interest immediately. And what they were being retrained for was to be trained in weaponry properly, and then to be relocated back in their villages to defend their villages against insurgent forces who didn't want to end the war. So what I did then to get them to believe or to understand and recognize the fact that they needed proper training was I put them to test in various ways, in friendly ways, by introducing competitions and things like that, where they entered a sort of a marksmanship competition or whatever else, and they quickly saw for themselves that they needed training, and then it was a lot easier to get them to cooperate with me.
And also, I need to raise the person who you call Martin in the book, and he's the self-appointed leader of the auxiliaries, and I should mention that how Martin ends up with the auxiliaries is documented in the book. But Martin himself was or is an intelligent man, from what you said in there. But did you had to do anything in particular to identify with Martin, aside from the fact that only 2 weeks ago you would have shot the guy on sight?
Yeah, and he would have shot me too. No, Martin was, or maybe is still, a very intelligent man. He was able to act as an interpreter with a lot of the other auxiliaries in the camp who were not fluent or didn't understand him, and therefore he sort of became my right-hand man. But I also noticed an unusual amount of competency in his comprehension of what was required and where this whole thing was going to, and so on. And so I worked with him a lot. Now, one of the things that's so important that worked for me and with my auxiliaries that didn't work for other camps with theirs is that I believe that it was one thing teaching them what to do. It's another thing getting them to do it efficiently. And by that, I mean I had to deploy with them on operations and work with them and show them how it's done and lead them into it, and then as quickly as possible to get Martin to take over from me, but I was still there, to get him to take over from me and to start leading his own people. And that way, it was a confidence building thing right from the beginning, and because of the competency levels that they were achieving, they became naturally aggressive and wanted to take on the opposition and had no mercy for them either. So it was a multidimensional approach. Martin was such a star, he could see trouble coming 6 months before it arrived, and he imparted that atmosphere, let's say that appreciation, onto the other auxiliaries. And the standard of the tactical approach and their understanding exactly of what it was to be undercover assassins. We operated against these link men with handguns, not with AKs eventually, because we found out that if you take out the link man, you disorientate the terrorist gangs in the field, because the intelligence wasn't passing, the communication wasn't passing that way. But you can't just walk up to a link man, let's say who's based at a church or a shopping centre, and pull out an AK, and he's not going to stand there and watch you pull out this AK and wait for him to be shot. So the only way to do it was by close quarter engagement, and with a revolver that they were Smith & Wesson 38 specials, snub-nosed revolvers. A revolver in the pocket of one of my operators who was dressed like a civilian, and he would get the attention of the link man, distracted somehow or the other, and just put his hand in his pocket and fire a chunk of lead into the link man's chest. And that is the way that we operated. And then there were times that we had to operate in uniform as well. But all my guys carried a spare set of civilian clothes with them, and it was easy to melt into the population. So our opponents couldn't actually find us because they didn't know who we are or were. And it must have been terribly frustrating for them. We never lost a single guy. Not one even had a scratch after 5 months of operating in the bush. Actually, it was less. It was 3.5 months, because I spent 6 weeks training and more often than not, our opposition didn't even have a chance to fire a shot at us. And in fact, most of the time we didn't even have a medical pack with us. So it was really a highlight of my military career was those 5 months with those former terrorists, and they were actually good guys. You know, a lot of them, the civilian population, were forced to join the insurgent forces, the revolutionary forces, and they didn't want to be there in the first place, and secondly, they were interested in protecting their families against other insurgents who badly mutilated them in the process of intimidating them and so on. So they had a mutual interest with us security forces to protect their own people and their villages, and that was their inclination to do well, and we were able to protect them, because every time there was hostages or informers left over after we attacked the terrorists sleeping in the villages, and we relieved the hostages that they were holding, we moved those people to a safe farm where we could protect them. So that is the key issue of counter-revolutionary warfare, is you've got to be able to protect the population that supports you, otherwise you won't have their support for long. And maybe that's some aspect that military forces should be paying a lot more attention to these days than I gather is being done. I'm not there to prescribe to other people how they should be doing it in other countries or wherever, but the fact remains that the same information that I'm talking about was contained in those documents that Special Branch gave to me originally, and nothing has changed about that.
And you've covered quite a bit of ground there, but you use the MO you've described already to take out the missile gang, or at least the elements of the missile gang, but after you were supplied with the intel where they were, you ended up more in a role of directing the operation as opposed to taking a frontline part in it. So how did this make you feel?
Yes, this is very interesting, because I was the first security force member to know where the missile gang was, that they had arrived in this remote village and they'd taken over the village, and they were holding hostages like they normally do to prevent anybody from the village going and alerting security forces that they were there, except that the headman managed to get away, and he walked the best part of 30 to 35 kilometers through the bush to come and fetch us, to come and alert us. And he arrived at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and he told us, he said, if you guys don't get to my village by first light tomorrow, they're going to start killing the hostages. So this was Rhodesia's most hated and most wanted terrorist gang of all in the whole war. And here's me sitting as a trooper, bogus captain, and not knowing that I daren't make this information available to any other security force units other than the SAS, for fear that they would all rush in there and botch it up, and the missile gang would be able to escape and bring down other aircraft. I mean, it was proved later on that this was the same gang that brought down the Hanyani before. So I didn't know what to do, but I did know that I had to get out of the SAS very quickly, and they were based in Salisbury and I was in Karoi, which was a good 2 to 3 hours travel from Salisbury. We just didn't have that time available. So looking at the situation, and I don't want to disclose too much for the benefit of those people who still going to get my book and want to read about it for themselves. Let's just say that I was able to put together an attack group, and I sent Martin and one other of my top guys with them and the headman, and they walked through the bush the whole night long, and they got to the particular village when it was still dark. They identified a terrorist presence there, and at first light there was a firefight, and it was between us and the group. They were a hardcore group. They fought bravely and furiously. It lasted 5 to 7 minutes, I would think, and the result of that contact is in my book. But the reason why I stayed behind was because there was a helicopter group based at Karoi, and they were staying overnight. So I knew that this contact would go down first thing in the morning, and that I would need that helicopter group for upliftment and follow-up operations. But I couldn't tell them anything about that until the contact had occurred on the following morning. So I mean, the adrenaline rush that I had, I was actually quivering with excitement. And I couldn't sleep knowing that this was the missile gang and that our attack group was on the way there to go and deal with them. What a pleasure. So the reason why I didn't go with was because I knew the location of more or less. I mean, I wasn't sure exactly where it was, but I knew more or less where it was. And I had to brief the helicopter group as where to go and what to expect when they got there. And furthermore, my fellows were trained. They were known to the local population. If something had gone wrong with that attack on that group, and let's say the group had run away and were regrouping somewhere else, I had the authority, I had the operatives who could go after them, and I knew where to put them down. So I had to stay behind in a support role. Now, although it agonized me a little bit that I wasn't there to pull the trigger myself, it didn't really bother me because it was the success of the mission that really mattered most of all. And that could not be compromised under any circumstances. The other reason why I stayed behind was because I knew that all the hostages and informers and everything would be on the first lift with the helicopters back to Karoi, and that there would be spies in the population who would be able to identify who they were. So there was a need to get those hostages and informers away from Karoi as quickly as possible and to relocate them on the farm. And I had to be there in order to manage that. So that's it in a nutshell.
Just before I leave the program, before the missile gang was finally caught up with, a second Viscount passenger aircraft flight RHA-27 was brought down. So can you just tell us a bit about the second shoot down?
We expected the second shoot down because of a couple of missiles, SAM-7 missiles that had been found near the Chirara Safari area, which is sort of in the vicinity of Kariba Airport. Let's say about a 20-kilometer radius on the south and east sectors of Kariba, of Zambezi River and then Zambia. So we actually expected them, but the terrain was extremely dense, rugged, forested, thickly forested, and the chances of trolling in what amounted to 3,000 square meters of, not meters, kilometers of uninhabited land, and just coming across a group carrying missiles was about zero. So we positioned ourselves so that when and if an aircraft was attacked and it was brought down, that we would be in the right place to intercept the group coming towards us, going south. So that we could intercept them. Now we had a pretty good idea that was what was going to happen. for a number of reasons which people can read about in my book, but we strategized for that, and this is exactly what happened. The aircraft, the Amniati, on the 12th of February 1979, was due to take off from Kariba Airport on its flight back to Salisbury, and the way that the prescribed way for Viscount aircraft and other civilian passenger carrying aircraft was to spiral upwards over Lake Kariba until a certain height was achieved, and then to head south towards Salisbury from there. The Amniati didn't do that, but it's only in recent months that we've found out why it didn't do that, and that was because of other aircraft in flight in the area at that time. The air traffic controller actually instructed the captain of the Amniati to take off in the eastern direction, which he did, and he was also told to maintain that direction. Now, this was heard by another pilot who I've since come to know, and he's actually shown me his logbook when he's written these things in there. So when it has been authenticated. Anyway, the aircraft took off from Kariba and headed towards some elevated terrain which was pretty mountainous and rugged, and from where the terrorists could actually see the aircraft approaching from a long distance, and to prepare to launch the missile. Now, to launch a missile takes a few minutes. It doesn't happen. It's not like swinging an AK around facing the opposite direction and pulling the trigger. There's a procedure involved with this, and it takes a little bit of time. But they had the advantage of seeing the aircraft coming along, and the SAM-7 missile, by the way, trails the aircraft. You can't fire it directly at approaching aircraft because it relies upon the heat and the infrared footprint from the aircraft to zero in on it. So its limitations are quite stringent, and unless one is properly prepared and trained to fire it, you're probably going to miss. So unfortunately, the group didn't miss with the missile. It hit the inner port engine, which then hung vertically for a while from the wing. There was an explosion. I believe it was a fuel tank explosion in the wing. Eyewitnesses saw a bright flash, and then the aircraft coming down. It took about 20 seconds before it actually crash landed. It didn't crash land, it plummeted into the ground, into a ravine, and with such velocity and an impact, high impact, that the total area in which debris was found was about the size of a tennis court, and there were no intact bodies found at all. The largest body parts that were found were a woman's pair of forearms, and the rest was shattered pieces of flesh and whatever spread all over the place. So those poor passengers must have had a terrible time coming down, knowing that they were going to die. And this is what fueled our revulsion for these Viscount disasters, and particularly the lack of condemnation. You've got to see things like that to really be inspired enough to do something about it. And that's probably what's inspired me to get the memorial built. That's at the Fuchika monument in Pretoria. The hunt for that missile gang started when those gang members came running back through the area that we expected them to come in, but in fact, the work that we'd done prior to that was of more significance, because we'd already gained the hearts and minds of the local population, who were not on the side of the insurgents, and it was them that came and told us where they were. So we weren't able to stop the second aircraft from being shot down, but we did stop the terrorist gang in its tracks from carrying on bringing other aircraft down.
Well, thank you very much for joining us on the Keith. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you, and I'm very glad to have read your book. It's an emotional read in places, as I've outlined on the show, but history should not be sanitized under any circumstances. That does a great disservice to future generations and the reader. And I am particularly fond of first-hand historical accounts, which your book is. So, again, thank you for joining us.
Well, look, just before we go, I just want to mention that few people who read my book, who were in special forces in other parts of from other countries, have questioned the two bombs that fell upon us, and they said, no, been. But there is confirmation of it in other books, and I'm going to refer quickly to a book written by Beaver Shaw, and it's called Chopper Tech, and it's on page 151, and there he confirms the bombs that came down upon us and the fellow that got killed and all the rest. And also in a book written by Prop Gelderhuys called Airstrike, that is also coincidentally on page 151 of that book, and he mentions it as well. So the people, the skeptics, the natural skeptics, I would expect them to be skeptical, can have a look at that and they'll see it's been verified in two other reference sources. So there can be no doubt whatsoever that what I've written about it there is 100% accurate.
I don't have a hard time believing your account simply because of the fact that my dad has a bit of shrapnel close to his heart that the doctors never removed for medical reasons, and that must have been a very close call for whatever reason. The shrapnel didn't go into his heart and kill him, but that is again just one of those things, I guess. So people do have these narrow escapes. It happens. How and why is certainly another discussion.
That's right. Okay, Luke. Well, thank you very much for having me on your program, and I wish your listeners happy reading. And don't forget to look at the DVD, because then you'll hear DaCosta's sermon live, you'll hear the BBC interview live with Nkomo, and you'll hear the accounts from the 3 survivors who watched the other 10 being butchered, and what they had to say about it. It's a very informative DVD, and things mentioned in the DVD by the survivors actually can be correlated with what I've written about in the book as well.
Oh, absolutely. The DVD is a must-watch. It contains interviews with the survivors, both in the present day and an old news sort of footage of a survivor being interviewed. And yes, the DVD is definitely well worth getting a hold of a copy.
It also has got footage taken from the crash site the day after it happened. I'm talking about the Hanyani crash.
Yeah, it does, and we have to leave the program there. I would like to thank the listener for listening to this extended show.
Thank you. Goodbye.
The interview with Keith Nell that I just conducted should provide plenty of food for thought for the listener. What I certainly find as someone of Australian heritage is that I'm ashamed of the role Malcolm Fraser played in installing Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Malcolm Fraser, in recent years, in my opinion, has been busy reinventing himself to try and get out of his role in the dismissal of the Gough Whitlam government. But it's also hard to fathom why he would let in boat people, refugees from South Vietnam, or the former South Vietnam, but would allow Mugabe to take power within Rhodesia. The rise of Mugabe in Zimbabwe is sometimes talked about, and there's slap on the wrist sanctions put in place, but how Mugabe got in power, there is a deafening silence, which is not surprising considering how the Commonwealth and Margaret Thatcher was primarily responsible for this. Yet when you look at Africa today, none of the lessons from the past Cold War mistakes have been absorbed by Western political leaders. We go to the Horn of Africa, Somalia, and there's a bunch of Islamic extremists running around there, and we don't have a foothold there, despite it being a vital shipping lane for the world's merchant ships. So it's only a matter of time before we pay the strategic price for that, whether it be a Chinese-backed government or the Islamic extremists get a hold of anti-shipping missiles or some other tools that we will find most undesirable. The fact that I was able to personally connect with events in the book beyond just the shoot down of the aircraft or the feeling of absolute horror and revulsion at what took place also made it a very emotional read for me in places, as I discuss in the program. And I hope that the listener will be able to connect with Keith Nell's account in their own way as well. I remind the listener that they can get the paper version and hardback version of the book from viscountdown.com, and the Kindle version is on Amazon. Thank you for listening to this special and extended edition of the show.
You have been listening to The Lens of History with Luke Herbert.